Ronald Reagan understood the strategic value that Iran gave the United States with regard to the Cold War. Iran was in many ways the final frontier between the West and the Soviet Union.
Ronald Reagan had entered office as a Cold Warrior with a focused anti-Soviet agenda. But with civil war in Lebanon, the emergence of Hezbollah, terrorist attacks on the military, and the kidnapping of American citizens, the world he faced while seeking re-election presented new challenges. Battles and covert operations continued in Central America without the support of Congress. New leadership emerged in the Soviet Union, and with it, a sense of hope not seen in decades. And Iran, long a nemesis for the Reagan team, dealt the administration a near-fatal blow in what became known as the Iran-Contra affair.
It's so murky, still after all of the investigations of it, the Tower Commission report and all, it's still pretty murky that the selling of arms through Israel to Iran, right, that part of it. But then the diversion of the funding to the Contras, that clearly was not a part of the policy.
Those stories and more in Part 3 of The Reagan Presidency.
I think that's just been arranged.
With a landslide victory paving the way for his second term, the president took office reiterating his support of the anti-Marxist rebels known as Contras.
We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth.
Congress had passed the Boland Amendments to deny U.S. funding of the Contras. But the president and his team took their search for funding offshore.
You cannot establish confidence in your allies, in this case the Contras in Nicaragua, if you obviously aren't able to say with confidence that we're going to be able to continue our support next year and the year after and the year after.
The Cold War was driven by secrets. Skirting the Boland Amendments with offshore financing was no exception. Later investigations revealed that Saudi Arabia alone provided more than $30 million in Contra funding. With proxy wars in Central America and Afghanistan, strategic challenges in the Middle East, and U.S. missile deployment ramped up in Western Europe, relations between superpowers had rarely been worse. As those in the White House considered their options, Ronald Reagan could not have known that his partner for change, real change, was waiting in the wings of the Politburo. After an unremarkable 13 months as General Secretary, Konstantin Chernenko died. His successor, 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev, assumed office as the youngest Soviet leader in more than 3 decades.
Brezhnev died, Andropov died, Chernenko died, and then finally you get Gorbachev.
People saw in Mikhail Gorbachev a much more moderate reformer and somebody who I think a lot of West Europeans felt was someone that they could live with.
When it became clear that Gorbachev actually wanted reform, that was the first glimmer of hope for Europe in many decades.
Gorbachev was a sensation. He was young. He looked healthy. He moved.
The main feature for Gorbachev was not only absurdity, but actually impossibility of the nuclear war. So that meant for Gorbachev that this kind of war, in any case, not only could not be won, but could not be fought.
The Soviet Union had to come to a particular place in its own history where it was vulnerable to an American push to roll it back. Mikhail Gorbachev is a part of that story because he thought he could reform the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev is formidable because if he didn't have a new type of Soviet leader ready to do business, I'm not sure Reagan's charm would have overwhelmed them.
You know, his speech sounded to us then so sophisticated. Like, he was a Moscow University graduate. We felt, wow. But the style changed, and there was this feeling of fresh blood. Oh my God, he can talk. That's what we told each other. He answers questions. He reacts. He thinks.
World events continued to unfold in dynamic fashion. Anti-Soviet unrest in Poland, a sympathetic ally in the Vatican, the fight to end apartheid in South Africa, famine in Ethiopia, a controversial dictator in the Philippines, terrorist attacks on cruise ships and airliners. With the emergence of Gorbachev, the president's foreign policy focus narrowed. At the same time, black and white policies in Central America and the Middle East began to gray in what would soon be called the Iran-Contra affair.
And there was one major scandal that had the potential to destroy the Reagan presidency. It was Iran-Contra.
The kidnapping of William Buckley in Lebanon was, by now, one among several. It became a catalyst for action.
And the president, in a very human way, felt, I'm the president. These are Americans. They're being held against their will, probably tortured, and I should be able to do something about it.
In the chaos of Lebanon, Hezbollah used the hostages to build its own base of power.
The United States has CIA agents and assets in the country. Hezbollah is beginning to kidnap many of these individuals for ransom. It shows the costliness of being involved in the Middle East. But it quickly then gets elevated to a very, very high level of politics in which the Iranian government is utilizing some of these Americans in order to put pressure on the United States.
Where some saw complications, others saw opportunity. Iran wasn't faring well in its war with Iraq, and they needed American weapons. At the same time, Iran had influence over Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So when somebody came along and said, well, Mr. President, we might have a big change in our relations with Iran, and if we sell them some arms, that would help do it. And by the way, Mr. President, we also get our hostages back. That hit him in the gut.
Ronald Reagan understood that only Iran could control Hezbollah. The hope was that in selling arms to Iran in the midst of this devastating war between Iran and Iraq, that he would be able to free the American hostages being held by Hezbollah.
The idea was originally an Israeli idea, that there was a need for the United States to sell arms to the Iranians, make sure that the Iranians were not defeated. In return, the Iranians would give up American hostages in Lebanon.
So the president, the vice president, Bill Casey, the DCI, and the chief of staff, Don Reagan, and I, in the beginning, said we ought to determine whether or not what Israel is saying is true.
Among the challenges facing the administration was its own stated policy. Neither the U.S. nor its allies were allowed to sell weapons to a terrorist-sponsoring nation. In this case, Iran. There were many agendas at play. Most were in conflict. The U.S. wanted its hostages released from Lebanon. Iran wanted American weapons to battle Iraq. Israel and the U.S. both wanted regime change in Iran.
The end objective was to find a way to bring back, and these are the words of Shimon Peres in a letter that he wrote to Ronald Reagan in 1986, bring back Iran into a broader strategic relationship with the West.
It was not
such a crazy idea if you start with the right premise. Premise being that there really is a possibility of changing the nature of this regime enough so we can have some parallel interests. And to do so, you use weapons because that's something they need and we've got.
From our point of view, to be able to trust that they had some influence and the ability to serve our interest, they had to be able to demonstrate that by releasing hostages. And that scenario was to have involved one shipment and all the hostages.
Between August and September of 1985, Israel shipped more than 500 anti-tank missiles to Iran on behalf of the United States. Of the 7 hostages in captivity in Lebanon, a Presbyterian pastor named Benjamin Weir was the only one initially released.
It soon became evident in September, after that shipment was made and one hostage was released, there was bad faith.
The consequences grew when news broke that American hostage William Buckley was dead. An Iranian-backed organization called Islamic Jihad reported that the CIA operative had been executed while in captivity. Later reports said Buckley had died months earlier from torture and poor medical care. Buckley's death had an impact, but it didn't stop the transfer of weapons and funds. Beyond the White House and partners in Israel and Iran, the operation was still secret, and repercussions of the murky deal were months away. Throughout his presidency, huge crowds had gathered to protest Reagan's nuclear policies.
In dealing with the peace movement, Reagan was quite different from, say, the Nixon reaction during the war in Vietnam.
I believe he thought, I agree with them. Let's get rid of nuclear weapons. But let's do it in a way that protects our national interest. So I think he agreed with the goal.
They may have shared the goal of a nuclear-free world, but not the path toward achieving it. With Gorbachev as a partner, things were about to change.
Good evening. This is Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, speaking to you from Washington about my upcoming meeting with General Secretary Gorbachev in Geneva and my hopes for a better relationship between our two governments. Your leaders can...
It had been 6 years since leaders had faced each other across a table, and thousands of nuclear warheads had been deployed by both sides.
Their attitudes were frozen, the politics were frozen, the places were frozen. And suddenly with Gorbachev, you got this thaw and things started moving.
Reagan proposed the summit and Gorbachev accepted. And in fact, the letters between Gorbachev and Reagan are an incredible source for understanding the end of the Cold War. Because in those letters from the very beginning, Reagan is writing about the evil of nuclear weapons, about his abolitionist ideas, and about necessity for dialogue.
A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
After years of harsh rhetoric, proxy wars, threats, mistakes, and a significant buildup in nuclear arms, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev shook hands for the first time in Geneva.
Each came across to the other as somewhat stubborn. In particular, Gorbachev wanted to kill the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Reagan felt was essential.
Their first conversation, it started like an ideological confrontation, but it ended like a conversation of two human beings.
Reagan would always stress what is going to be good for the Russian people. And there was this very human dimension of his negotiating strategy. He was fortunate to have opposite at the table Gorbachev.
The details, such as which missiles to eliminate, were difficult to navigate. It would take time.
They both were, some would say, dreamers. They both thought these weapons are inhumane, unusable, and mankind had to eliminate them and had to find a way to eliminate them.
Would another president have tried to reach out to Gorbachev? Probably. Would another president have said, let's do away with all nuclear weapons? Probably not. Because very few presidents harbor that apocalyptic view that Reagan had inherited.
Among the most important outcomes of the Geneva summit was a mutual desire to meet again.
I can't claim that we had a meeting of the minds on such fundamentals as ideology or national purpose, but we understand each other better, and that's a key to peace. I gained a better...
I think it had also another significant element. It was the passage from the stage of what you would call the megaphone diplomacy to the conversation diplomacy.
Now after Geneva, after this program, we know even if we disarm completely, they're not gonna attack us. There is no more talk about first strike from the United States, and therefore you can go for really deep disarmament, which is what Gorbachev wanted anyway, to fix the economy and to end the Cold War.
Just 4 days after leaving Geneva, President Reagan was informed by Deputy National Security Advisor John Poindexter that the first shipment of Hawk missiles had arrived in Iran. The scope of the three-way deal was growing, along with the consequences. Despite later denials, several members of the Reagan team knew about the arms for hostages deal. McFarlane was the negotiator, but Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger had to authorize the weapons shipments. Weinberger had told investigators from the FBI that he rarely kept notes or a diary. However, during investigations after Weinberger and Reagan had left office, independent counsel Lawrence Walsh and his team uncovered thousands of pages of Weinberger's notes and diary entries in storage at the Library of Congress. Weinberger wrote about a meeting with President Reagan and others on December 7, 1985. I argued strongly that we have an embargo that makes arms sales to Iran illegal. Plus, President couldn't violate it. Plus, washing transaction through Israel wouldn't make it legal. Schultz, Don Regan agreed. President said he could answer charges of illegality, but he couldn't answer charge that, quote, big strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free hostages. The national security team was divided. McFarlane had been involved from the beginning, but he eventually abandoned the plan.
The error, among several, was to imagine that you could do this with so few American resources involved, not really supported by the cabinet level of the government or any financial or other resources. So it was a misguided idea, not in its goal and purpose, but, and I explained that to the president. I resigned from the administration.
According to McFarlane, he resigned in part because the deal failed to deliver the release of all of the American hostages being held in Lebanon.
But I fought myself about it because I feared that the president's very genuine concern for the hostages was going to lead him to keep going in some fashion.
And the administration did continue. The deal was no longer about facilitating regime change in Iran. It was about trading arms for hostages. Legal or not, it wasn't working.
I learned before long that indeed it was still going on, and I received communications from people on the NSC staff and my successor, John Poindexter, that it was still supported by the president.
Before Washington and Moscow could resume nuclear arms talks, the Soviets fell victim to a catastrophic explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Many died. Tens of thousands were exposed to radiation and forced to relocate, and the area remains contaminated today.
I would say that Chernobyl catastrophe paradoxically moved Gorbachev closer to Ronald Reagan.
What became clear was that you didn't even need to use nuclear weapons
to devastate a country. World War II bombs on a nuclear power plant could destroy the whole region from the fallout.
The crisis at Chernobyl was costly. Soviet resources had been drained by their failed war in Afghanistan, and many in the United States believed the Soviet economy was vulnerable.
By 1985, you had to stand in line to buy anything. But in terms of military production, in terms of defense budget, it did not have any slowdown at all.
Cutting military production would take time, but Gorbachev made many changes at home that could not have been imagined before he entered office.
Perestroika means restructuring, and it meant restructuring the economy. Glasnost meant openness, and glasnost is really what clicked with people. The society was so closed and so secretive, and suddenly they were telling you, from the TV, from the newspapers, Pravda was writing about it. You can't discuss anything.
In Gorbachev's mind, the reform that he was bringing was supposed to make his country more modern and competitive in order to be equal partner of the rest of the world.
As Moscow engaged in new policies of openness, Washington was enmeshed in secrecy. Neither Congress nor the public was yet aware that the administration was trading arms for hostages with Iran. And questions about the CIA's role in Central America surfaced when the Nicaraguan military shot down a cargo plane they claimed was being used to resupply the Contras. The lone survivor, American Eugene Hasenfuss, initially told Nicaraguan authorities that he was part of a CIA-authorized operation. The president disagreed.
While they may be American citizens, there is no government connection with that at all.
A later congressional investigation determined that the operation to resupply the Contras was covert and had been sponsored by elements of the U.S. government. Secrecy may have shrouded policies in the Middle East and Central America, but the public was very much aware of the second Reagan-Gorbachev summit taking place in the tiny nation of Iceland. Gorbachev arrived in Reykjavik with more than just a desire to roll back the arms race. He hoped the summit would have a positive impact on the domestic challenges he faced, pushing glasnost and perestroika.
And in order to be able to attack the challenge of the transformation and the demolition of the Stalinist system in the Soviet Union, he had to produce results on the foreign policy front.
The General Secretary abandoned previous Soviet tactics.
And Gorbachev came right at the beginning, basically proposing from the Soviet side all of the positions that we had been battling for. It was breathtaking.
The Soviet discussions before Reykjavik are fascinating because Gorbachev says our ultimate goal is elimination of nuclear weapons. To achieve that, we will make major concessions.
Gorbachev comes with a package for everything, which would be a 50% reduction of everything in 5 years, and then an elimination in another 5 years, provided that research for defensive systems were kept in laboratories, that is, not tested, for at least 10 years.
It's better than any suspense novel you can read. It's so emotional. They come so close to actually agreeing on abolishing nuclear weapons. And Reagan cannot give up SDI for many reasons.
Reagan was extremely disappointed, and he says in his diary he was also angry, because at that time he felt he had been lured to Reykjavik just to kill SDI.
If you look at the photos of them at the beginning of the negotiations, they are so beaming. They wanted this meeting. They like each other. And then they come out and they're stricken. Their faces are they're just stricken. They are leaving, both so disillusioned.
We are deeply disappointed at this outcome.
But Gorbachev suddenly realizes that they did not achieve it, but they touched it. They were so close that it's possible. And because it's possible, it's not a failure, it's actually a breakthrough.
And it was this internal feeling, a psychological feature, which allowed him very quickly after Reykjavik to untie the package of his proposals and to ignore practically the SDI, to behave as if it never existed.
But the substance of what they had agreed upon, these were the most sweeping and widespread agreements that had ever been made, not only between the US and the Soviet Union, but between any two countries.
Still, some of America's staunchest allies echoed comments reminiscent of détente.
Margaret Thatcher flies to Washington and she blasts Reagan, who's an old friend, and she says, this is crazy. Nuclear weapons kept peace. Our whole strategies are based on nuclear weapons, deterrence, stability in Europe, everything. There is a conventional superiority of the Soviets. What are you gonna do if you abolish nuclear weapons?
I had the honor of interviewing Margaret Thatcher at the British Embassy here in Washington. She was still mad. Mad. I don't mean irritated, I mean angry.
Despite the subdued U.S. reaction to the summit and criticism from supporters, the Reagan team believed progress had been made.
We have it within our grasp to move speedily with the Soviets toward even more breakthroughs. Our ideas are out there on the table. They won't go away.
Just 2 weeks after returning from Reykjavik, an additional 500 TOW missiles were sent to Iran. A few days later, American hostage David Jacobson was released from captivity in Beirut. The next day, a Lebanese magazine called Al-Shura broke one of the biggest stories of Reagan's presidency. The United States was selling arms to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages.
Firsthand about our dealings with Iran.
The story had legs, and just 10 days later, the president shared both details and denials with the American people.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon.
After denying that weapons were being sold to obtain the release of hostages, President Reagan summarized his policy.
Our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force. In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
A week after the president's speech, then Attorney General and longtime Reagan friend Ed Meese began an investigation into the arms for hostages deal. The wall of secrecy unraveled quickly. 3 days after the investigation began, Attorney General Meese advised the president that up to $30 million from the arms sales to Iran had been funneled to Contra forces in Central America. The deal was outlined in what Meese called a diversion memo, authored by National Security Council staff member Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. What had been termed the arms for hostages deal was now being called the Iran-Contra affair.
You know, selling weapons to Iran, which had held Americans hostage at the embassy, in order to fund the Contras, a group in Nicaragua, in contravention of at least two laws. It's a pretty big scandal.
Before accepting the resignation of John Poindexter, Reagan fired his assistant, Oliver North. The president also created the Tower Commission to investigate the role of the National Security Council. Former Republican Senator John Tower led the commission. A criminal investigation was launched roughly 2 weeks later, headed by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh. As questions grew about the role of the president, his approval rating suffered the worst one-month drop in U.S. history.
There's a big debate about whether or not Reagan knew any of this. There's no evidence that he knew the details, or there's not firm evidence. But he did say to his aides, keep the Contras together, body and soul. And so that's what people did.
But I pledge to you, I will set things right. If illegal acts were undertaken in the implementation of our policy, those who did so will be brought to justice.
The president tried to convince the public, but many Americans were uncertain.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions.
I think he did what he has to know.
I thought it was an honest effort to come clean.
He wasn't watching what he was supposed to be watching all along, and I can't forget that.
When he testified before a meeting of the Tower Commission, the president said he had authorized the first shipment of tow missiles from Israel to Iran in 1985. 16 days later, before the same commission, Reagan retracted his earlier statement, claiming he didn't know about the arms shipment. The president appeared confused during the interview, leading to media speculation that he might be tired or suffering from a failing memory.
Was he confused? Yes, he was confused. Was he an older man? Yes, he was an older man by that stage. All that is true. Was he lying? To me, I just have to tell you, as somebody who worked with the man, that is not just unlikely, but unthinkable. Unthinkable.
In his book, Special Trust, Robert McFarlane maintains a loyalty to the president. He explains Reagan's Tower Commission testimony by saying, Reagan, after first supporting me on his approval of the Israeli shipments, was soon convinced by Chief of Staff Don Regan and White House counsel Peter Wallison that he hadn't approved them. In a February 20th letter to the Tower Commission, Reagan offered a different explanation, saying, the simple truth is, I don't remember, period. Although highly critical, the Tower Commission report drew few hard conclusions. But they did say, quote, even if Mr. McFarlane did not have the president's explicit prior approval, he clearly had his full support. Many questions remain. Before Congress began an investigation of its own, the president addressed the nation.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. There are reasons why it happened, but no excuses. It was a mistake. I did approve it. I just can't say specifically when.
That's a moment that I will always remember, Ronald Reagan. It almost brought his presidency down.
The president's approval rating had slipped dramatically during the scandal. Trust in the White House was in question, and key staffers, including Chief of Staff Don Regan and CIA Director William Casey, lost their jobs.
The polls began to show that for the first time, people didn't trust him. I don't think he felt that he'd done anything wrong. But what I always felt hurt him, and it did hurt him, it was almost like a physical pain, was that he lost the American people.
There was little time to feel the pain as the U.S. was drawn once again into the war between Iran and Iraq. Tensions were high in the Persian Gulf, and with Iran-Contra now public, U.S. alliances to either side were shaky at best. 37 U.S. sailors were killed when their missile frigate, the USS Stark, came under attack by a French-built Iraqi military jet. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein later apologized for what he called an unintentional incident.
The mission of the men of the USS Stark, safeguarding the interests of the United States and the free world in the Gulf, remains crucial to our national security and to the security of our friends throughout the world.
During the final months of his presidency, Ronald Reagan returned his focus to the old foe he found familiar, the Soviet Union. As Congress and the Independent Council continued their investigations, the president journeyed to Berlin and the fabled Brandenburg Gate.
1987, Berlin was celebrating the 750th anniversary of the founding of the city. The White House decided that it was a good time for Reagan to go to Berlin and make a speech there.
The same man who weeks earlier had looked tired and forgetful returned to his rhetorical roots, offering an historic challenge.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To the Germans, the important historic symbol was the Brandenburg Gate. To the Americans, the Berlin Wall. But was a way of putting down a marker. Are you serious? Do you mean it? To Gorbachev.
Reagan, from the start, believed that it was not just about arms control. It wasn't just about signing agreements with the Soviets. The Soviets really had to change conditions and change the way in which they governed this huge part of Eastern Central Europe and their own country.
The president made the decision to speak directly to General Secretary Gorbachev. Today, the speech remains one of Reagan's most talked about, but with no clear consensus on its relevance.
That speech was a long time ago now, and all my life since, I've had it some place in the back of my mind, it's never left my mind, the question, what difference did it make? Did it have any effect?
We also know from later documents that it had absolutely no impact on anything. It was seen in the Soviet Union as purely a propaganda move.
I don't believe that the Berlin Wall came down because of this speech, but I do think that the speech was part of a context and part of a relationship that Reagan and Gorbachev had developed in which they essentially were spelling out the conditions under which the Cold War would end.
Gorbachev knew life was better in the West, and less than 2 weeks after Reagan's speech, he convinced his own Communist Party to pursue a policy of economic, social, and political reconstruction. As the president prepared for another Soviet-American summit in Washington, the Joint Congressional Committees issued their final report on the Iran-Contra affair.
We conclude that he created, or at least tolerated, an environment where an illegal diversion of funds to the Contras was viewed as consistent with his policies.
Despite objections from some Republicans, it concluded that the ultimate responsibility for the events in the Iran-Contra affair must rest with the president. Criminal charges for many of those involved were still months away. Good news on Soviet-American relations continued to play to the president's strengths as General Secretary Gorbachev made his first visit to the United States.
This summit has lit the sky with hope for all people of goodwill.
Old tensions between the two leaders had turned to smiles when they signed the INF Treaty, jointly eliminating more than 2,500 short, medium, and intermediate-range missiles. But not everyone was happy.
The extreme right of the Republican Party began, in his last year to say he's gone soft and so on. There were actually 5 or 6 Republican votes against the INF Treaty.
Many conservative allies felt the INF Treaty set a dangerous precedent.
Lots of people, including people in the CIA, thought we were all wrong and almost to the end opposed the efforts that President Reagan was making with the Soviet Union.
There were a lot of conservatives who thought Reagan had lost his mind, that he didn't know what was going on. And if you look back, Reagan and the people closest to him made the right call. They were right. The skeptics were wrong.
It was over 6 years ago, November 18, 1981, when I first proposed what would come to be called the zero option. It was a simple proposal, but with patience, determination, and commitment, we've made this impossible vision a reality.
Once change began, it happened quickly for both nations, especially for the Soviets. Opposition from within, led by Poland and Czechoslovakia, was having an impact in Moscow. Their long Soviet war with Afghanistan had been costly, and Gorbachev called for an end to the fighting. The U.S. agreed to pull back on its support for the Soviet enemy, the Mujahideen. But front pages in the U.S. were dominated by criminal indictments in the Iran-Contra affair. Former National Security Advisor John Poindexter, Oliver North, and 2 colleagues were charged with numerous felonies for their role in illegally funding Nicaraguan Contras with funds derived from arms sales to Iran. And as lawyers for the accused mounted their defense, President Reagan made his first visit to Moscow. Their 4th summit included both arms talks and a renewed push by Reagan for the Soviets to embrace human rights. The openness policies of Glasnost were affirmed when Reagan met directly with Soviet dissidents.
The United States views human rights as fundamental, absolutely fundamental, to our relationship with the Soviet Union and all nations.
The president also spoke to students in a lecture at Moscow State University.
But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication.
Nobody spoke about human rights. Nobody. And what struck me is how confidently, simply, humanly he addressed all these issues.
And in a sign that the Cold War really was drawing to a close, Reagan and Gorbachev walked together in Moscow's Red Square. It had been 5 years since the president had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Things had changed.
I was talking about another time, another era.
The president also credited Gorbachev during his press conference from Moscow.
No, I think that a great deal of it is due to the General Secretary, who I have found different than previous Soviet leaders have been.
The Cold War was settled by negotiation to the interests of both parties. The idea that this was a victory is absurd. Gorbachev defeated communism in the Soviet Union, not Reagan and the United States. Reagan and Gorbachev made it possible for him to try to reform.
But history 100, 200 years from now will see really Gorbachev as a linchpin of the revolution of 1989, and that he worked with other people to accomplish it, like Reagan, like George Herbert Walker Bush, like Pope John Paul II, like Chancellor Kohl.
Reagan himself never said we won the Cold War in the sense of a victory over the Soviet Union. He said our ideas won, yes, but it wasn't a military victory. Gorbachev began to implement our values and political ideals and tried to turn his own system to it. And the end of the Cold War gave him the opportunity to do that.
Shortly after his return from Moscow, the president's holiday vacation was interrupted by a civilian tragedy in the Middle East. An Iranian commercial jetliner flying over the Persian Gulf was shot down by the U.S. Navy. Combat teams from the USS Vincennes had been on heightened alert since the attack on the USS Stark. Commanders believed the airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, was an Iranian F-14 fighter jet poised for attack. In an event eerily similar to the Soviet downing of KAL-007 nearly 5 years earlier, 290 civilians were killed on what Iran claimed was a routine commercial flight to Dubai. Despite outrage from Iran, there was little reaction in the United States.
I accept your nomination for president.
And with the nomination of George Herbert Walker Bush as the next Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan's two-term tenure as president was winding down. Like most presidents, the measure of Ronald Reagan's success or failure in foreign policy can only be assessed over time. He ran for president pushing domestic policy. But global events and new leadership in Moscow created both challenges and opportunities. And today, many would argue that his greatest achievement came in foreign policy as he helped bring an end to the Cold War. The president made the point himself during a farewell address to the nation.
Not only have the superpowers actually begun to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and hope for even more progress is bright, but the regional conflicts that rack the globe are also beginning to cease.
History will decide how much credit to give the Reagan team, but few will question their commitment or the positive direction the U.S. and Soviet Union were headed as Reagan left office.
We meant to change a nation, and instead, we changed a world.
While closely linked to the end of the Cold War, the outcome of Reagan's policies in Central America was strongly influenced by leaders in the region. After negotiating a five-nation peace accord, Costa Rican President Oscar Arias was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to stop the fighting.
Teníamos nuestras discrepancias, nuestras divergencias.
We had our differences, but looking ourselves in the eyes, we had the courage to come to an agreement for the good of 40 million Central Americans.
The long-term impact of Reagan policies in the Middle East is still playing out. The president's decision to pull back American forces following terrorist attacks on both the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Lebanon remains controversial. Hezbollah, which came to power during the Lebanese Civil War, has gained significant political and social influence in the region. When Ronald Reagan was sworn into office, 52 American hostages held in Tehran were released by their Iranian captors. 8 years later, America's relationship with Iran remained at a standoff. The U.S. role in the Iran-Iraq War and the White House decision to deal arms for hostages had, in some minds, made the situation worse. Of the Americans taken hostage in Lebanon, only 3 were released as part of the arms for hostages deal. 2 were found dead. During the same period, several additional Americans were taken hostage before the last arms shipment to Iran was made in October 1986. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, played a significant role in Reagan's Cold War policy. The system was never completed. Approximately $40 billion was spent on SDI before the program was eliminated in 1993. Just 10 months after George H.W. Bush was sworn in as Reagan's successor, the longtime symbol of the Cold War crumbled under growing political unrest from Moscow's allies throughout the Eastern Bloc. The Berlin Wall had kept East Germans inside their own border for nearly 30 years. Hundreds had died trying to escape. But in the end, Germans on both sides of the wall used their bare hands to reunite East and West.
This is the first peaceful democratic revolution on German soil. And in some ways we owe it to the Poles, we owe it to Gorbachev, and we owe it to Ronald Reagan.
One of the myths later is that the speech brought down the wall. The wall was brought down by the Germans and the Czechs and the Hungarians and by the Soviet tolerance and openness.
The Cold War had already ended, ideologically and politically. It was not the speech that brought it down. It was the change in Gorbachev's policies, which continued into the Bush administration because we began to negotiate things without the polemics.
Determining the final outcome of the Iran-Contra affair took years. Before leaving office in 1993, President Bush issued pardons to 6 members of Reagan's administration, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. After a 7-year investigation into the Reagan White House, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh concluded that President Reagan's conduct fell well short of criminality which could be successfully prosecuted. But Walsh also concluded that President Reagan created the conditions which made possible the crimes committed by others. A few months after release of the Walsh Report, Ronald Reagan published a letter to the American people acknowledging that he suffered from Alzheimer's disease. He lived his final years in retirement with his wife Nancy at their California home. Ronald Reagan died on June 5, 2004.
If Ronald Reagan...
Leaders from around the world attended his funeral at Washington's National Cathedral, including his former adversary, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Nancy was there for him always.
While scholars may take sharply different views on his legacy, few would dispute Ronald Reagan's impact on contemporary political debate.
He began realigning the American electorate around conservative principles. The idea that America is a country that should embody freedom, liberty, democracy, equality, all of those things, that they're central to the American fabric, that America is much more of an idea than it is a set of institutions, or brick and mortar.
When it came to principle, Ronald Reagan believed that you had to do what was right. And that's why we remember him, and that's why he achieved what he did.
Ronald Reagan, as brilliant a politician as ever walked the planet, persuaded people that big government was the one ruining their lives. That was such an amazing political sleight of hand, and it has stuck. It has stuck, and it's conceivable that it will destroy the American government.
Are there long-term problems with Reagan policies? Yes, we're seeing them in the misreading of Reagan in the 21st century. But as we get further away from Reagan, 50, 100 years from now, he's going to be seen not quite as politically powerful as his ghost is right now, but will be seen as a top 10 American president.
Throughout his presidency, Ronald Reagan shared his belief that America was a beacon to the world, a shining city on a hill. He made the reference a final time when evaluating his 8 years in office.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.